Sure. I would like to welcome everyone. As Janeen said, there have been other webinar conversations, but this is the first time that both of the participants, both of the leaders of the conversation, have been members of the museum group. We're happy that this is something that has sprung from a relationship that Janeen and Gretchen have been developing over several years. And I'll just give you a little bit of background information on them. Janeen has been working in the field since 2005. She is an intersectional educator, facilitator, trainer, and agitator. And after working for many years at the Levine Museum of the New South, she started her own consulting practice called Facilitate Movement. And she serves as a community engagement specialist and catalyst for organizational growth. She has recently been a columnist for the Charlotte Observer, and she has also written widely for such groups as Museums and Race and Mass Action, which is museums as a site for social action. Gretchen Jennings has worked in museums for over 30 years. She served as editor of the journal Exhibition, which is part of AAM's NAME organization. And since 2009, she's been teaching every other year in Kolkata, India, as part of the National Council of Science Museums. She blogs at Museum Commons, and with Janeen, she is co-founder of the Empathetic Museum Collective. And she too has been a member of Museums and Race and Mass Action. So we're really happy to have both of you here today. And we're going to hear from Gretchen and Janeen, and then we'll have a question and answer session after that. But we do have a place where you can enter your questions at any time in the chat room. And I will see those and be sure to get to them at the end. So without further ado, Janeen and Gretchen, let's listen to you talking about the Empathetic Museum.
Great, thank you, Daryl.
So this is Gretchen. Hello, everyone, and thanks, Daryl. We're thrilled to be able to talk a little bit about the Empathetic Museum. And you might be asking, well, exactly who are we and what do we do? And there are, I think, two important things about us that we'd like to share with you that are very much a part of our identity. First, we're a group of colleagues who advocate for institutional empathy as a transforming force in museums. And we emphasize institutional empathy. There are a number of initiatives right now led by museum colleagues who work on museum programs and exhibitions that encourage empathy in visitors. And we support all of these efforts, but our focus is really on museums as organizations and what we have found to be their lack of empathy, of connection with some audiences. So all of our work is directed at encouraging and reinforcing the idea that museums as institutions need to be more empathetic. A second thing that's key to our identity is the historical context. And maybe Janeen, if you could go back to the previous slide. We really emerged out of a lot of social conflict and turmoil that has happened in our nation in the last 7 or 8 years. And there's been a growing national awareness and conversation on issues of racism and inequality, not just in museums, but in our society in general. And beginning in 2012, as a new Twitter user, I began to notice that while the whole country was talking on social media, as well as other kinds of media about Trayvon Martin, my colleagues on the Twitter feed were silent. It was as if Trayvon Martin didn't exist. And I began to notice this on social media in particular over the next several years with Hurricane Sandy, with the Boston Marathon bombings, in 2014 with the killing of Michael Brown, that museums were essentially aloof and silent, and with some exceptions. And the exceptions, for example, with Hurricane Sandy were libraries who opened their doors to the people around them, to their neighbors. And with regard to racial issues, it was museums who either had African American leaders or who themselves were African American museums. And I began to think that this is skewed. Really, all of us should be considering these issues as our own issues, and not simply African American museums or museums that have a specific interest in tolerance. These are something that all of us should be concerned about. So we began then to develop this concept of empathy. It was really the best word that I and my colleagues, as we began to meet at AAM conferences, it's the best term we could come up with for what we were seeing in the responses of cultural institutions to national issues. And it's important to note that we really find the Merriam-Webster dictionary definition to suit us perfectly well. When we ask people at our at conferences or at workshops what they think about empathy and what their definition is, it's generally something like this: a resonance, a connection with the experience of others. And you notice that the dictionary definition talks about empathy as an action of understanding, of being aware of, and sensitive to the experiences of others, and often without even being told specifically. So what then is institutional empathy? We really see it as the authentic alignment of an organization with the experiences, values, and needs of the community it serves. And because we see empathy as an active characteristic, we have come up with 5 characteristics that we feel that museums and cultural institutions can follow in order to become more empathetic. And on your screen, you see 4 columns, but then our 5th characteristic is the arrow that goes across the bottom, performance measures. So just to say a couple of words about each of these characteristics, they are processes, programs, decisions that museums can take to become more empathetic. First is civic vision, that the museum really sees itself as part of the civic infrastructure. And we were quite influenced by Lord and Blankenberg's book, Museums and Soft Power, where they talk about museums as anchor institutions along with universities, hospitals, schools in their communities. Museums have to believe that they are among these anchor institutions. Museums need to be aware of their institutional body language, not what they say about diversity and equity, but what they embody in their building, in the location of their building, in who visitors see when they come into the front door, in the kinds of collections they organize in their exhibitions. What are museums communicating non-verbally about themselves that is being picked up by their communities? Community resonance, how the museum is connected to its community, either because it does in its board and staff and collections really represent the community that it serves, or at a minimum, if it doesn't have the kind of diversity that it should have, that it has very strong connections, advisory groups, collaborations with its community. Timeliness and sustainability are very important for empathy, for institutional empathy. Is a museum able to respond when there is a crisis, like the Boston Marathon bombing in its community? It's not reactive, it's not one-off, it's something that can be sustained. And finally, an empathetic museum is constantly examining itself and its work and being transparent about any changes and adjustments that it needs to make. In order to help museums work with these 5 characteristics, we've developed a tool that is called a maturity model. And what you're seeing on the screen is actually an abbreviated version of our maturity model, which is much more detailed and really doesn't fit well on a slide, but you can download it from our website. And so we've expanded on these 5 characteristics to show that museums can take specific steps to achieve them. A maturity model is an organizational tool that's used by institutions to facilitate change towards some specific goals. And the model helps an organization both to assess where it is and also to plan for where it wants to go. So you can see on the left, we have the 5 characteristics that were shown in the previous graphic. And then we have a scale of achievement that goes from regressive or negative, where the museum is really hardly practicing whatever the characteristic is at all. And then that moves through steps to emerging steps to practice the characteristic, to more focused planning, and finally to be proactive. So for example, take one characteristic, civic vision. Maybe there's a small historic house in a city that doesn't really see itself very much as part of the civic infrastructure. And so it's very regressive in its view of itself and its understanding. Maybe it used to be in the center of town, and now the town has kind of moved away and the community around it has changed. Maybe it's an immigrant community now. So the museum then maybe begins to be aware of this community that is not connected to it at all. And the historic house begins to think about how can it communicate with the people who live in its neighborhood. Maybe it begins to produce materials that are in a number of languages. Maybe it holds family days, and then begins to actually collaborate with community organizations. So this is just one example of the ways in which a museum might go from regressive to proactive in developing its civic vision. And we feel that museums can use this tool, as we said, both as an assessment of where they are and also to give them some hints about where they can move toward empathetic practice.
So I've noticed that there are a number of people on the call today who have actually either utilized the Empathetic Museum rubric or have actually utilized it and invited the practitioners in our group to come and help their institution develop a more rigorous interaction with the rubric. The use of the rubric as an organizational tool really gives not only a theoretical framework, but some practical and implementable practices that institutions can have. Most of the time when organizations are grappling with the use of the rubric and they take the time to do some self-diagnostic, what we find most of the time is that they will rate themselves as either highly in the emergent category or in the planned category. And so what we've invited organizations across the country to do, and we've worked at this point in Seattle, in Tacoma, in Austin, in California. We have some sites in the Midwest, and some very dear sites here on the East Coast. What we've invited them to do is to utilize part of the rubric as a diagnostic tool in which they not only ask people on their staff, but to utilize this with their docents, board members, and even some visitors and guests in thinking about how do you rate your own experiences of empathy at the institution? And so, as an organizational development tool, what we really hope that institutions do are think about the assumptions that they have as an institution about the ways in which they utilize any of this language in creating more deeply empathetic spaces. And we do firmly believe that empathy is an action and that it will take skill and constant interrogation for us to actually become more empathetic institutions that constantly examine their own assumptions, their vocabulary, their thought processes, and their practices internally, not just externally. And so, to that end, we did create not only this resource, but we've recently written a piece that appears in the Curator. And in that piece, it's an opportunity for people um, to really examine their own history with empathy and the role that they play in their institution. But we do know that most institutions will couch this as very hard work. And so we want it to be really clear that there are parts of this organizational development tool that require quite a bit of effort. So we don't want to oversimplify the effort it takes. If it was simply that people could take a template and apply it to their institution and solve all their problems, then we wouldn't have to do anything more than provide the PDF. Instead, we ask people to utilize this as a diagnostic and then to use that to help set priorities internally about where they want to go. Just as Gretchen indicated, we've seen a number of institutions that set very specific priorities on and also give themselves timeline for which to work with to move from what ultimately was deemed as regressive action, perhaps even regressive civic vision, and moving towards proactive status. They need to get buy-in. So a lot of times institutions will simply claim that they are empathetic, and usually it is a very outward facing activity. So getting buy-in requires that you not only get the internal stakeholders to buy in, but that you do a significant amount of work to demonstrate that your community has buy-in, understands what you're trying to do, and actually has informed the work. Then you actually have to implement the change, which obviously any change making process requires a lot of effort. And so we don't want to minimize that, but you also have to constantly evaluate your progress. And I use the word interrogate because I think oftentimes much of our work is situated in privilege or supremacy, and it takes a lot of interrogation to shine a really bright light on what we're doing that may either be promoting anti-racist and empathetic action, or may actually be impeding those same actions. It takes time, and we know museum time usually is a lot longer than out in the world. And so we think of this as an internal change process management tool, and really want to help people understand what they can do internally, and to help get that buy-in. And we do also know that even as we're using the word empathy in the Empathetic Museum, we know that the ways in which we're talking about this, most of the time people use this only in terms of human behavior rather than thinking of it as an institutional posture. So this may really cause some people to think that we are not adequately utilizing the right word for what we're talking about. So we know we're pushing up against the limits of our current language around diversity, inclusion, equity, and access. And that new vocabulary, we submit to you all that new vocabulary will emerge as we continue to do this work together and find new ways to talk about the intersections and where the next frontier of our work will go. A lot of times you will hear people use the phrase get comfortable with discomfort, but we believe that we're on the growing edge. And so you shouldn't let this stop you. If it feels slightly uncomfortable, if it feels like you don't have quite the right word, that it's okay. And to continue to find those who are doing this work and who you can align with and lock hands with. And also, we also recognize that as you read the rubric, you might sense that it was white dominant focus. Our institutions are culturally framed in a way that must constantly be dismantled if we're really trying to move the needle on issues and asking our leadership around their cultural competency. So the framework is somewhat flexible. in that it can be applied for a very specific department. We've seen individuals use this to interrogate their own behavior. We've seen this used across an entire institution. And your missions don't all have to be aligned. Your communities don't all have to share the same history. And so we've asked that people try to utilize this and differentiate their experiences using the rubric to make sure that they are using it in a way that makes sense for their institution. So it is a very flexible and adaptive framework. And we ask that people maintain the willingness to go on this journey with us. We do feel like this is a journey. So yes, Gretchen, this is you.
Oh, hi. Yes, I just wanted to mention also in terms of language that in the article that Janeen mentioned that's in the October Curator, we have a glossary of terms at the end. So we specify how we talk about things like community, colonization, decolonization, implicit and explicit bias, and so forth. So we hope that that will be helpful to people who make use of the article. We recommend that there are 3 steps that institutions can take to working with the rubric and working toward empathy. And the first is awareness. In other words, it, as Janeen was saying, it needs some digging, some understanding, maybe some looking at the history of how your museum was founded, where it was. If you're in an area that was segregated during Jim Crow days, what was the museum doing in those days? Was it also a segregated space? There are many things about our history that remain in, if not in living memory, then in community memory, and that might shape the way that that our audiences and our potential audiences look at us. So becoming aware of that with some work in really looking at the museum's history is important. And then coming to accept that, discussing that with the whole staff, again, as Janeen mentioned, and perhaps with advisory groups as well, and coming to really see in what ways have we been a very white privileged institution. Is that the institutional body language that we've been communicating without perhaps even being aware of it? And then finally, with using the maturity model, this can help with specific actions that are directed toward your particular institution's history and position, its historic position, its current position, and ways that you can make changes to move what you're communicating to your audiences toward empathetic practice.
So there are some things that we believe that you can do with the article. This article was published earlier this year, but we wanted to make it accessible. It is behind a paywall. We wanted to make it accessible. So we actually took portions of the article and truncated it into small cards that any museum educator, development officer, front-facing staff could utilize just to quickly get a snapshot of things that they could make actionable right away. So as an example, we really place a lot of emphasis on what we've seen historically is that the education department usually ends up holding up this work. And what we didn't want to happen is that, yet again, that the education department, and I'm speaking as a former music educator, that the education department be tasked with finding ways to make us empathetic, finding ways to make the programs more empathetic without really evaluating the behavior that we see sometimes in, take for instance, our development office. So what would this look like to think about the context in which we recruit not only board members, but sustaining sponsors and funders? What would it look like for us to think about the messaging and who sits on our board and how do we inform that? I think we see this increasingly throughout the field in that there are many people who, many people and staff members who are questioning our typical modus operandi and asking, what do we need to do in order to diversify the board and to create a more cohesive and collaborative vision with our community? So these can be found on our Twitter feed. for the Empathetic Museum at Empathetic Muse. But you can also find these on our website, along with more information and more additional resources that you can use as you go forward. So thank you all for having us on today's talk.
Thank you, Gretchen and Janeen, for sharing with us. I love the way that you have thought about who's going to be using this rubric and tailored it to various internal and external audiences in terms of the museum stakeholders, not only educators, but development staff and trustees. You have really made this as accessible as I've seen any new model. So that's awesome. And as you both mentioned, this article, the full title of which is The Empathetic Museum, A New Institutional Identity, is available even if you don't subscribe to Curator. You can just go to the website, empatheticmuseum.org, and request a copy. So if any of you have questions, please post them in the chat room. I see there is already one here, and it says, how does this work of empathy relate to fair, equitable pay in museums? So who wants to start on that?
Well, I can comment. I think it definitely relates. In other words, empathy really has to be holistic and authentic and internal. So if a museum is not paying its staff a living wage, if it doesn't provide benefits, if the working conditions are really poor, this is not an authentically empathetic institution. And we do mention these kinds of things in the rubric. So yes, definitely internal treatment of staff is very important to kind of the authenticity of an empathetic institution.
Janeen, do you want to add anything there?
Yeah, I agree with that. I think oftentimes we see institutions ignoring the plight of staff. And so we can think about this in terms of salary and pay. We can also think about this in terms of access and availability of the staff to be fully present. So, you know, if you've never considered whether or not your staff is saying things like, I don't feel as if I can be myself at this institution. I don't feel that this is a welcoming institution. I don't feel that I'm a part of a staff that value each other or can hold each other accountable without reprisal. Any of those things that you see happening are really symptomatic that you're actually regressive as an organization and you might be hindering the development of your staff. And so I think that's really emblematic. We hear those kinds of things when you can get the staff to be really open and candid. And so if you've never had an open and candid conversation with your staff, that's also a kind of a flag that your institution may not be doing the work in which they need to do.
Okay. Here's a question from Karen Wise asking you, Janeen, if you could speak a little more about the challenge of not having the precise words and working iteratively with the inevitable, quote, foot in the mouth that museum people sometimes step into when they're grappling with or attempting to even name the issues that they see in terms of different kinds of inequality, and how museums can be reinforcing this. Any examples of that?
Well, I want to start by saying thank you for that question. And also acknowledging, I don't know if you all are familiar with there's a piece that it's passed around pretty commonly. Dr. Portia Moore introduced it to me a while ago, but it's the 13 facets of white supremacy, of which one of the factors that stays on my mind constantly as I work with museums is this idea of perfectionism. So overall, there is a fear I've seen amongst practitioners in more than a decade in the field. I've seen that there's a fear of messing up. And so there's constantly a reinforcing of behaviors that will just exacerbate disparity, because there's this fear like we won't get it right, we won't say the right word. And so typically when we do these presentations, we give a couple of examples of institutions who've tried this, including Eastern State Penitentiary. We show a tweet by Harvard University in which they were saying that they just got a $10 million grant to study Black poverty in the Boston area. So they were really excited. This is a tweet from 2016. They posted it, and at the same time, their dining hall staff was on strike for living wages. So there you see, like, there's an example of the institution really having a lot of dissonance between what's actually being experienced in their community and in their internal context, and them trying to externally give the posture of empathy, deep community relatedness, and change. And so I think this idea that we could fail together, or that we could fail forward, is something that we all need to embrace. And that's one of the reasons why we're very explicit about this when we're doing any work with some of our partners. And I believe there's a couple of partners on the phone who have engaged with us for this work, but we're really explicit that we're going to be learning together. And so that, you know, the staff gets space for grace and space to mess up and trip and fail, and that we're going to give ourselves room to be both candid with each other and to positively reinforce when we get it right, and to self-correct and to hold each other accountable without fear that this will be some kind of massive conundrum for the institution that we won't be able to overcome.
I'd like to add something to that question as well. On the Mass Action site, which is at the Minnesota Institute of Art, there was a toolkit developed that raises questions about many organizational aspects. And the Art Institute of Chicago developed a series of discussion forums, and they met, I don't know whether it was, I forget if it was weekly or monthly, with it. They conducted all staff meetings. Anyone was free to come. And there were questions for discussion and a reading of one section of the toolkit. And I think that something like this helps the museum staff to talk together, to get used to different terms that they might not have heard before, words like white supremacy or oppression or privilege. And if you're talking about this on a regular basis with all staff, that may help to mitigate some of the foot and mouth syndrome that the questioner was asking about.
Good, thanks. I have a question that I have been wondering about since I read the article. In it, you refute the notion that museums must not take sides. And we've seen within our field this movement that museums are not neutral. Lately, we've been seeing that even if museums are afraid to take sides, their communities, and often the artists whose work they collect, do take sides, sometimes in a very public way. And you know, we know many examples of the demands that they have made to remove board members and even rename museums. So I wonder, Gretchen and Janeen, if you think that this force that's coming from the outside to change museums might be strong enough to force museums to be more empathetic.
Well, I certainly think that it can't hurt. You know, if museums are hearing this from their audiences, whether current or potential, you know, if there's push from both the inside and the outside, then I think that's very useful. And I think the movement, museums are not neutral, which was, I mean, it's been talked about, but certainly Latanya Autry and Mike Markowski made the T-shirt, and you know, it spread everywhere. But really, museums have never been neutral. I remember asking a museum scholar about this, and she said, you know, I think it comes from the early origin of museums out of the Enlightenment and the idea that science has to be very objective and so forth. And so museums kind of developed this idea that, oh, we can't speak out. But the thing is, this is related to the idea of institutional body language. Even if you're not speaking out, everything about your institution really shouts who you are. You know, who you collect, what exhibits you choose to mount. All of those things are already taking a stand and presenting a stand. So museums can't hide really behind this idea that they were or are neutral.
Yeah, I would add to that. It was couched to me that neutrality was based on the protection of their 501c3 status, which I also reject, because there is a certain amount of advocacy that any nonprofit can do, and not all museums are even couched under nonprofit protected status anyway. So as Gretchen is saying, our institutions, the lack of action is also making a very clear statement to your community. And so the supposed neutrality, I think, really positions our institutions to be irrelevant. I don't think we're in the time frame in which we should be actively trying to hide behind statuses, even as our community sometimes our communities are literally on fire, while museums are still trying to hide behind their neutrality.
And especially knowing that museums are such trusted institutions, you know, this is something that we've seen in surveys over the years. It's a lost opportunity for museums to maintain this sort of bogus notion of neutrality. Boy, today more than ever, right?
Right.
Absolutely.
So here's another question in the chat room. This one comes from Matt. What are the biggest or the most prominent barriers or hurdles that exist between moving from regressive towards emergent and progressive? Do you see any trends there where people get stuck? You're smiling, Janeen.
Number one, I appreciate Matt for chiming in. He was one of the people who helped us get Empathetic Museums off the ground so many years ago, in our first iteration. And do note that there's a number of people who are involved with Empathetic Museum, including Stacy Mann, Kaylee Bryant Greenwell, Charlotte Hope. There's a number of people who are not on this call, Jen Cullen, who are actively involved in this work and are actively helping to not only design the experiences, but the answers to questions just like this. So Matt, I appreciate your question. So one of the trends that I've noticed as we've asked people to kind of take these diagnostics, and I guess you all can see my screen, but this rubric has checkboxes beside it for which you can check. And what we've noticed is that we ask different departments to do the checkboxes, we'll inevitably find that the leadership rank themselves very high, and that they consider themselves to be quite empathetic. But if you ask the front-facing staff, and we include security and docents, people who have to directly interact with your visitors and guests, but they'll usually rank the institution quite low. So there's a real disconnect, and for me, kind of some egocentrism that I think is inherent in museum leadership, and their unwillingness to interrogate their own practice and to find ways in which they can dismantle maybe their own heightened esteem regarding the power of their leadership. And so that's one of the trends I think that can really prohibit good work. There's other trends as well, but that one's the one that made me smile, is that often leaders overestimate their level of empathy and don't do a lot to interrogate that.
Right. And thank you, Janeen, for mentioning that there are others who have been involved in this journey with you and Gretchen. I'm just looking at the article here, and there are several co-authors in addition to you and Gretchen: Jim Cullen, Haley Bryant Greenwell that you mentioned, and Stacy Mann, Charlotte Hove, and Nayeli Cepeda.
Yes.
So they all contributed to the article as well.
And if I could just mention that Nayeli has translated the rubric into Spanish. So for those of you who are more comfortable in the Spanish language, the maturity model is available in Spanish as well. And Nayeli will often translate an article or blog that we've posted as well.
Great. All right, I have another question that just came in through the chat room from Mary Ellen. What thoughts do you have about performance measures and evaluation methods, which run across all of the 4 areas? Some of the methods we depend on now, like interviews and focus groups, continue to position the museum as the authority. Now, we're the ones who are asking the questions. We know what we do, and we just want to know if you like it, basically. So from the get-go, it seems like that relationship is unbalanced and therefore unempathetic. How can performance measures and evaluation be more empathetic?
This is a question that I have more than a response, but one of the things that I've noticed as I've read Visitor Studies Journal and looked at evaluation over the years is that I believe that most visitor assessment and research is really silent on the variable of race or ethnic background. I'm sure there are some. For example, Emily Dawson, a British researcher, has done a lot of work with communities of color and their perception of and understanding of particularly the science museum field and science museums in Britain. And she's written an article called "Not Designed for Us," which comes from the work that she found. So I guess a question that I have about visitor studies is, where is the variable of race and racial experience? How is that, or can it be worked into an understanding? In other words, we've kind of, I think, taken it as a norm that, kind of it's the white gaze in a way. And then, but how can the assessment of museum practice incorporate a variety of experiences with race and look at how they influence people's experience of an exhibition? And I honestly don't know the answer to that, but it's something that I have thought about as I look at various visitor studies, rubrics and materials.
And you can ask that question about individual performance measures. I think oftentimes if you are writing a grant narrative, that's when you start to see where people will try to heighten their social impact and their dependence on whether it be empathy or social justice or whatever word they're using at the time, or diversity and inclusion, fill in the blank for the word that you use, without actually deepening their understanding around what the community needs. So that's one of the reasons why we start using a diagnostic, and by using that diagnostic, not as necessarily like a 360, but in terms of as a mechanism to give us some form of constantly auditing the work and for that self-interrogation process. So I think there's a level of performance evaluation that looks at the individual performance and looks at how people show up and what work they do. And I think there's also the kind of constant auditing. Do we see placement in the budget related to either diversity and equity? Have we seen it as a strategic screen, or how we build strategic plans? Is race mentioned at all, or is anti-bias or anti-racism mentioned at all in that planning document? Is it mentioned as a way in which we talk about our impact and engagement with our communities? Do we see it embedded in our board composition? Is our board reflective of our community? So there's so many questions. And so to Gretchen's point, like it actually starts by asking and continuously asking questions to really get to whether or not you're performing at a level. And you can't just ask each other. Like I keep saying, like, we have to ask our community, we have to ask our docents, we have to ask people who come through the doors, and we have to ask our internal staff. What I found is that most institutions will only do either or. And they pick the group that they think is going to be most agreeable to start with. So,
yeah. And here's a suggestion from Karen Wise. She recommends the book Equity, Exclusion, and Everyday Science Learning. She says is worth a read. So I assume that that was relevant to this question too, about performance measures and evaluation methodology. We have one other question that has come into the chat room, and this is from Barbara. And thank you, Barbara. How can this model be used to avoid potential setbacks due to stresses like financial sustainability threats? Now, how can this be seen as an asset, as something that can strengthen a museum instead of something else to worry about in terms of the bottom line?
Well, I think Janeen has at her fingertips some statistics about the ways in which museums are, becoming demographically less relevant and kind of out of tune with demographic changes in the country. And so she might want to speak to that. But I'm not sure that this could ever prevent disaster or setbacks. I think it would be something that might be an option for a museum that is struggling to consider. If the problem is lack of attendance, if the problem is lack of donor interest, this might be helpful. I guess another thing I would mention is, in talking with museums that have specifically been working on issues of decolonization, for example, Cinnamon Catlin Legutko, who was at the Abbey Museum for a long time, I remember her being asked about losing support and losing donors. Also, the folks at Eastern Penitentiary. And I think both of them said, yes, we did lose some people who were supporters and donors, but we also picked up a number of new ones. So it's true that there may be some people who are really disappointed in the direction that the museum is going, but my understanding is that a number of funding agencies are very interested in the kind of work that cultural organizations are doing in connection with diversity and inclusion.
yeah, I would agree with that. And I think it's really pivotal overall that, and I'm completely echoing Gretchen. Like, I don't think that utilizing empathy is going to prevent anything. What I do think is that it puts a stake in the ground around empathy. Doesn't go out of style. Unfortunately, it could get pushed to the margins, but it doesn't go out of style to act in ways that demonstrates care for your community. And so, and I'm using the most simplistic terms there, but it doesn't go out of style, and it increases your relevance. So this is one of those things where you can see this manifest in your turnover rates. You can see this manifest in your hiring practices and in your visitor engagement. And you've got to be willing to say, like, if I was to do a return on investment analysis on empathy, what am I seeing? Does it behoove me and my institution to really grapple with this question of whether or not we are creating spaces in which people are moving through kind of an organizational development towards being proactive and really heightening of internal awareness, thinking about the roles of the institution and the community. Are we doing that for real? Or are we exacerbating the very problem that we say that we're trying to solve? because people will eventually recognize if an institution is not doing this work for real.
Right. And you point out in the article that the need to make social justice relevant and, you know, at the heart of museums is not just part of our current zeitgeist. So the question is not when is this going to be replaced with the next thing, but how much longer do museums have in their life cycle if they remain disconnected and non-empathetic? You know, this, in some cases, this could literally be a do or die issue for museums. And maybe that's a good place to end it. The urgency of this, right? Not to be a downer, but to focus on this going forward. And so I just want to thank all of you for participating, and thank you, Gretchen and Janeen, for sharing this article with us and the rubric. And hopefully this will generate more conversations.
Thank you, Daryl. I appreciate you.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Indeed.